There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside old stone buildings. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of abandonment, but something older and more deliberate. The silence of a place that has held enough human noise over enough decades that it has learned the way a person learns when to speak and when to simply receive. Nora Finch would not understand this for another year. But sitting on the narrow wooden bench outside the chapel door one October evening, watching two deer move through the clearing without noticing her, she would try to write it down. She would sit with her notebook open on her knee and the lantern burning warm behind her in the caretaker's shelter. And she would find for the first time in her life that the right words came quickly, as if they had been stored here waiting the way everything in this place had been waiting. But that was later. This is before. Nora Finch had her mother's handwriting and her father's silence. She knew this because her mother Delia had told her both things separately in different years, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who paid attention to the people she loved. The handwriting comment came when Nora was 9 and had left a grocery list on the kitchen counter. In her small even script, each letter formed the same way every time, and Delia had picked it up and held it for a moment longer than a grocery list required. The silence comment came the year Nora turned 14. When a school counselor had called Delia to discuss Nora's classroom behavior, which was not disruptive, but was, in the counselor's words, unusually inward-facing for a girl her age. Delia had come home from that meeting and found Nora at the kitchen table writing in one of her spiral notebooks. And she had sat down across from her daughter and said without preamble that she had the same quality her father had possessed, the ability to be fully present in a room without making any claim on it. Her father had died when Nora was 5. A machine shop accident in a factory outside Albany, the kind of workplace death that fills 2 paragraphs in the local paper and is then folded into the statistics that nobody reads. Nora did not remember him clearly. She remembered the texture of his work jacket, a rough canvas that scratched her cheek when he held her. She remembered that he smelled like machine oil and something sweeter underneath, maybe just soap, maybe just him. She remembered that when he laughed, which was not often, it was sudden and genuine, the laugh of a man who had not prepared himself for the joke. These fragments were enough. She had assembled them into something that felt like a person, and she held that assembled person carefully. The way you hold something you know cannot be replaced. Delia had raised her alone after that in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood north of downtown Albany, where the streets were named after American presidents, and the rent was low enough that a legal secretary working 40 hours a week could keep up with it. The apartment had dark wood floors that creaked in specific places Nora had memorized by age 7, and tall windows that let in good light in the mornings, and a radiator in the living room that knocked and hissed through the winters with a kind of cranky reliability that Nora had found comforting. It was not a large life. It was not a life that expanded in many directions. But Delia had understood that the quality of a life was not measured by its square footage, and she had filled their small apartment with books and conversation, and the particular richness that comes from 2 people paying close attention to each other. She read to Nora every night until Nora was 12, and then continued after that when Nora asked, which was more often than either of them acknowledged out loud. She took Nora to the public library every Saturday morning, not as an errand but as a destination the way other families went to the park or the movies. She kept a small brown notebook in her purse in which she wrote down the things Nora said that she wanted to remember. Nora would learn what was in that notebook only after Delia was gone. She would sit on the floor of her childhood bedroom and read it cover to cover in one sitting. And the experience would be unlike anything she had words for, the strange doubling of recognizing her own voice in sentences she had no memory of saying, the accumulating weight of being documented by someone who had loved her. Nora had been a writer from before she could fully read. She made up stories and dictated them to Delia, who wrote them down without editing. She graduated to notebooks by age 7, filling them with stories and observations and descriptions of people she saw on the bus, or in the library, or at the grocery store. She was interested in people, but from a distance. She did not particularly want to know them. She wanted to observe them, to record the specific details that made them themselves rather than anyone else. The way the woman at the checkout counter touched the back of her own neck when she was thinking, the way the old man on the number 9 bus always refolded his newspaper to the same page, even though he had clearly already read it. She believed even at 7 that these details were the real story, not what people said, what they did without noticing. Her mother got sick when Nora was 17. The cancer was pancreatic, which meant aggressive, which meant the timeline was not measured in years. 6 months from diagnosis to the end, though the doctor had said 6 months in a tone that suggested he was being generous. Nora dropped the second half of her senior year without discussing it with anyone. There was no one to discuss it with. She simply stopped attending school and started being at home, which was where she was needed and where she chose to be, and the school sent letters that she set in a stack on the kitchen counter and eventually recycled unopened. She cooked. She managed medications. She learned to read the specific quality of her mother's breathing from across the room, the difference between sleep and exhaustion, and something more concerning. She read aloud to Delia from the books on Delia's bedside table, working through them in order without skipping or selecting, because her mother had stacked them in a particular sequence that Nora understood was intentional. She wrote down the things Delia said in the last weeks, not in her own notebooks, but in a new one she bought specifically for this purpose, a red hardcover with unlined pages that she kept on the nightstand within reach. Delia had understood what she was doing. There had been no need to explain it. One afternoon, Delia had looked at the red notebook and then at Nora and said, barely above a whisper, "You came out of the womb already thinking about something. Don't ever stop thinking." Siachi Yari. Nora had written it down. She had written it down, and then she had sat with the notebook closed in her lap and not written anything else for the rest of that day. Delia died on a Tuesday in April with the window open and the sound of the street coming in and Nora holding her hand. There was no dramatic last breath. There was no final sentence. There was simply a moment when she was there, and then a moment continuous with the first when she was not. And the distinction between those two moments was invisible to everything except the fact that the hand Nora was holding went from warm to something that was still warm, but differently so. Nora sat with her for a long time after. She was not performing grief. She simply was not yet ready to let the next thing begin. The next thing was Margaret Holloway. Margaret had worked at the same law firm as Delia for 22 years, arriving 3 years before Delia did, and outlasting her in the end. She was 62, retired, widowed, and living in a house in a suburb north of Albany that was too large for one person, and that she filled with careful routines rather than people. She had not been Delia's closest friend, but she had been the most reliable one, the kind of friend who showed up at practical moments, who had driven Nora to 2 hospital appointments when Delia could not, and who had organized the small gathering after the funeral with the quiet competence of someone who understood that competence was what was needed. When she offered to take Nora in, it was not a warm offer. It was a correct one. Margaret understood the difference between these things and believed that correct was sufficient. Nora moved into Margaret's guest room in May with a duffel bag and a box of notebooks and the red hardcover with the unlined pages that she put in the drawer of the nightstand and did not open again for a long time. The guest room was clean and adequate and smelled like lavender sachets and the faint cedar of the closet. There was a window that faced the backyard where Margaret kept a garden she tended with a schedule rather than a passion. Everything in Margaret's house had its correct place and was in it. The dishes were returned to the same shelf every time. The mail was sorted daily. The television was watched at specific hours for specific programs and then turned off. It was not an unkind house. It was a house that ran like a well-maintained machine, and Nora moved through it carefully, the way you move through a house that is not yours. She got a job at a used bookstore downtown within a month of arriving. The store was called Fulton and Company, although no one named Fulton had been involved in its operation for at least 2 decades. It smelled like old paper and coffee, and the particular kind of dust that accumulates only on books, which is different from other dust, in a way that Nora could not have explained, but would have recognized blindfolded. She worked 4 shifts a week, shelving and sorting, and occasionally recommending things to customers who asked, which she did carefully, because she understood that a recommendation was a form of intimacy and should not be made carelessly. She kept a small notebook behind the register in which she wrote down titles she wanted to read and observations about the customers who came in, which was she recognized precisely what she had been doing since she was 7, and which felt less like a habit than like a biological function, like breathing or circulation, something the body did to maintain itself. She saved almost everything she earned. She had a checking account at the bank 2 blocks from the bookstore, and she deposited her paychecks on Fridays, and she tracked what she spent in the same small notebook, where she tracked the book titles and the customer observations in a column on the right-hand margin. She was not saving toward anything specific. She was saving because she understood with a clarity she could not have articulated that she would need it eventually, that the current arrangement had a limit, and when it reached that limit, she would need to be ready. The limit announced itself not gradually, but all at once. The way a bone fractures, the stress has been accumulating for a long time, but the break happens in a single moment. The conversations with Margaret had been cooling for months. They had never been warm exactly, but there had been a functional warmth to them in the first year, the warmth of 2 people who share a loss and a history, and the dailiness of the same household. By the second year, that warmth had faded into something more formal. By the third year, the formality had thinned into something with an edge to it, expressed primarily through a specific kind of silence over the dinner table, and a specific kind of sigh that Nora had come to recognize as Margaret's most articulate communication. The sigh meant that she had expected more progress by now. It meant she had arranged her life to accommodate Nora's, and was waiting for Nora to reciprocate by arranging hers into something legible. It meant Nora was 20 years old and working at a used bookstore and filling notebooks with things that were not a plan, and Margaret was running out of patience for not knowing what to do with that. Nora understood all of this. She did not blame Margaret for any of it. Margaret was a woman who believed in structure because structure had held her life together through considerable difficulty, and she was applying the only framework she knew. The fact that the framework did not fit Nora's life was not Margaret's fault, and was not Nora's fault, and was simply the fact of the matter, the way 2 people can be equally decent and still wrong for the same house. 3 days after Nora turned 20, she woke at her usual hour and found the envelope on the floor just inside her bedroom door. Margaret had slid it under while Nora was sleeping. The envelope was unsealed, which meant it had been prepared and set aside and reconsidered, and not resealed, which was its own kind of information. The letter inside was typed, not handwritten, which told Nora something about the quality of care that had gone into it. It said that Margaret had reflected carefully on the arrangement and had concluded with genuine goodwill that it was no longer serving either of them well. It said that Nora was a capable young woman who deserved the freedom to make her own choices without the implicit weight of someone else's expectations in the same house. It gave 2 weeks. It thanked her for the time they had shared. Nora read it sitting on the edge of the bed in the gray early light. She read it twice. The second time she read it, she was looking for the sentence that had cost Margaret the most to write, the sentence where the politeness strained and the real thing showed through. She found it in the second paragraph, the part about making her own choices without feeling judged. That was the whole letter compressed into 11 words. She folded it and put it in the back of the notebook she was currently using, which was a spiral bound with a green cover that was already 2/3 full. Then she went downstairs and made breakfast the way she always did, 2 pieces of toast with butter and a cup of coffee. And she and Margaret ate together at the kitchen table, with the morning light coming in through the window over the sink, and they did not mention the letter. Margaret asked if Nora wanted more coffee. Nora said no thank you. They finished eating. Margaret rinsed her cup and put it in the drying rack and went to get ready for her book club. Nora went back upstairs and opened her laptop. She did not look at apartments. She had $247 in her checking account, which was not enough for first month plus security deposit on anything available in the greater Albany metro area. She did not want a lease anyway. She wanted something that could not be taken back, something that was hers in the way that a piece of ground is yours, not contingent on someone else's continued good feeling toward you. She pulled up the state's online property database and started searching for tax lien auctions in upstate New York. She spent 2 hours going through listings. She found vacant lots in townships she had never heard of, a partially collapsed mobile home in Schoharie County, a decommissioned grain storage building with a roof that had caved in on one side, a concrete building that had once been a veterinary clinic and was now described as structurally compromised. Most of them cost more than she had. Some of them were listed for $500 or $1,000, which was not $247. She almost closed the laptop twice. She did not close it. The listing appeared on the third page of results from Herkimer County. It was 3 sentences long. It described the property as a historic fieldstone chapel, approximately 400 square feet, situated on a 1.5-acre wooded parcel of old logging road in the township of Little Falls. Access by footpath only. No utilities. Condemned 1974. 11 years on the auction list with no bidders. Starting bid $1. There was one photograph. It was low resolution, clearly scanned from a physical print that had itself been old when it was scanned. The photograph showed the corner of a stone building, barely visible through a dense screen of trees. The trees were in full leaf, which meant the photograph had been taken in summer, probably in the early 1970s, based on the quality of the image and the slight overexposure at the edges that was characteristic of film from that era. You could see the angle of a roofline, the beginning of what appeared to be an arched window, and a quality of light falling through the canopy that was specific to late afternoon in a north-facing clearing. That was almost everything. That was nearly nothing. Nora stared at the photograph for a while. Something about the quality of the place communicated itself even through a bad scan of an old photograph, the way the building sat inside the trees rather than in front of them, as though it had grown there rather than been built there. There was a patience to the image, not emptiness. A quality of waiting that she recognized without having the vocabulary for it yet. She knew she was going to buy it before she finished reading the listing a second time. She wrote down the case number and the county contact information in her notebook and closed the laptop. She thought about the money problem for exactly 3 minutes. And then she went and knocked on the door of the room Margaret used as an office, which was something she had almost never done. Margaret was at her desk with reading glasses on, going through some paperwork. She looked up at Nora without expression. Nora asked directly and without preamble whether Margaret would lend her $200. She explained that she had found something, that she would be out of the house within the week rather than the 2 weeks she had been given, that she would repay the money once she was settled. She did not explain what she had found. She simply held Margaret's gaze and waited. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Directness from Nora, which she had rarely encountered, produced something unexpected in her expression, a slight softening, a reassessment. She opened her desk drawer and took out her checkbook, and she wrote a check for $200, and she held it out without a word. Nora took it and said thank you. Margaret said to take care of herself. These were the most honest sentences they had exchanged in 3 years. The bus to Little Falls left the Albany Greyhound terminal at 6:40 in the morning. The trip took close to 4 hours with a transfer in Utica, which Nora spent in a bus station that smelled like floor cleaner and vending machine coffee and the specific exhaustion of people who travel early. She had a granola bar and a paperback copy of Marilyn Robinson's Gilead that she had taken from the shelves at Fulton and Company years earlier and had been returning to ever since, reading it in sections and then starting again from the beginning, the way you return to a thing you have not yet finished understanding. She read on the first leg and then put it in her bag and watched the landscape change through the window. On the second leg, the way the farmland east of Utica gave way to forest as the bus headed into the foothills, the trees thickening and the hills lifting, and the sky narrowing between the ridges until the whole world felt closer and more specific. Little Falls was smaller than she had pictured. The bus let her off on the main street, which ran for 6 or 7 blocks before becoming a state highway again at either end. There was a hardware store that was open, a diner with a hand-lettered sign, a pharmacy, a bank with a peeling awning. The Herkimer County Annex building was a 2-story brick structure 2 blocks off the main street with American flags on either side of the entrance and a bulletin board in the lobby covered in notices that no one had touched in months. The property records office was on the 2nd floor. The woman behind the counter was in her mid-40s with curly, gray-streaked hair and red reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she was eating a sandwich and reading something on her computer when Nora walked in. Her name tag said Ruth Calder. She looked up without hurry. Nora told her she was there about the Little Falls Chapel, listing case number 2003-HK-114-E. Ruth Calder set down her sandwich. She pulled up the file on her computer and then looked at Nora over the top of her reading glasses with the expression of a person recalibrating an initial assessment. She said the chapel had not seen a bidder in 11 years and asked if Nora knew the access path was a mile long through private timberland, that the condemnation report listed significant structural concerns, that there were no utilities and no road a car could navigate. Nora said she understood. Ruth looked at her for another moment. Then she picked up a form and began filling it in. She completed most of the form, then paused and said she was going to add a line to the standard agreement. She explained that Herkimer County had a standing policy on historic properties. If the purchaser discovered any materials of potential historical significance on the property, they were required to notify the county within 30 days. It did not mean the county would take anything. It simply meant the record was preserved. Nora looked at the line Ruth was adding in careful handwriting at the bottom of the standard text. She understood it was a door swinging in 2 directions. She signed. Ruth Calder took the form, stamped it twice, made a copy, and slid the copy across the counter. "Welcome to Herkimer County," she said, her voice different than before, something that had been held at a careful distance allowed to move closer. "Take care of yourself out there." Nora put the copy in her notebook, thanked her, and walked back down the stairs and out into the afternoon. She walked from the annex to the edge of town, following the map on her phone, heading east on the main road, and then north on a 2-lane route that climbed gradually through a stand of sugar maples just beginning to turn. The leaves were at the point in early September where they had not yet committed to color. Still mostly green, but with a reddening at the edges the way a feeling shows at the corners of a face before it takes over completely. She passed a shuttered tire shop with plywood over its windows, a small cemetery with a wrought iron fence, a farmhouse set back from the road with a German shepherd standing at attention on the porch. The paved road ended at a gravel turnout where a wooden sign stood at a lean. Its post sunk crookedly into the ground. Its lettering faded to the point where she had to stand close to read it. Chapel of the Quiet Woods, private established 1923. The sign had been painted once a dark green that had weathered to something closer to gray. Below the lettering, someone had carved a simple cross that was still sharp-edged enough to have been cut more recently than the paint. Nora touched the cross with one finger and then turned to look at the path. It was barely a path. It was more the memory of a path, a corridor through the undergrowth that was slightly more open than the forest on either side, a slight depression in the moss where feet had once traveled. Fallen branches lay across it in several places, some of them large enough to require going around. The moss was thick and unbroken in the places between the branches, which meant no one had walked this path in a long time. The trees on either side were mature, their canopy high, and interleaved, filtering the afternoon light into something diffuse and soft and directionless. The kind of light that makes you feel like you are inside something. Nora adjusted the straps of her backpack and started walking. The forest had its own weather. It was cooler under the canopy than it had been on the open road, and the air moved in slow, invisible currents that carried the smell of wet leaves and pine resin, and something earthier underneath the smell of soil that had been sheltered from direct sun for decades. She walked slowly. She crossed a creek on a wooden footbridge whose boards flexed alarmingly under her weight, but held. She passed a large granite boulder with a wooden cross propped against its base. The cross weathered to silver, its crossbar lashed with wire that had oxidized to dark brown. She passed a clearing where a small outbuilding had once stood. She could see the outline of its stone foundation in the ground, the stones still arranged in a precise rectangle, the interior space filled with decades of leaf litter and the woody stems of ferns. She stopped at the foundation for a moment. Someone had built something here. Someone had built it and maintained it, and then eventually stopped coming, and the forest had moved in without ceremony and without urgency, covering everything at its own pace. She kept walking. The path climbed gently through a section of mixed hardwood, and then leveled out through a grove of white birch, whose trunks caught the filtered light and held it. The bark peeled back from the trees in long curls the color of old paper, and the leaves were already mostly yellow, a warm gold that seemed to generate its own light in the dimness of the forest. She walked through the birch grove slowly, and she thought about her mother in a way that was not sharp but diffuse an awareness of presence. The feeling of being in a place that a person she had loved would have also loved. The path curved around the last of the birches and opened without warning into a clearing. And Nora stopped. She did not go in right away. She stood at the edge and looked at the chapel. It was smaller than the photograph had suggested, and more beautiful. The walls were built of fieldstone gray and brown and greenish and rust-colored. Each one fitted against its neighbor with the careful imprecision of a hand-laid wall. The whole thing irregular in a way that felt organic rather than sloppy. Moss had colonized the shadowed sections of the stone. Ivy climbed the left wall, its stems near the base as thick as her thumb. The roof was slate, deeply weathered, almost black in the mossy sections, and lighter gray where the slope caught the sky. The wooden cross at the peak leaned slightly to the left, still intact, but the angle wrung the way a flower tilts when its stem is weak but not broken. A stone bench stood beside the door, tilted several degrees from level by decades of frost heave. A few dry leaves had gathered in the angle where the bench met the wall. Nora stood at the edge for a long time, long enough that a crow landed in the maple directly above her and regarded her with the flat professional skepticism of crows, and then departed without having reached a conclusion. What she felt was recognition. Not of the place itself, she had never been here. It was recognition of
It's
something. The
so
place
beautiful
contained
out
something
here.
in the
It
quality of the
is, dear.
silence
Let's
and the
take a
density
walk.
of the
I'd love
surrounding
that.
trees, and the way the stone sat so completely at rest on its patch of ground. The place knew what it was. It had always known what it was, and what it was had nothing to do with being useful or being maintained or being owned. She walked across the clearing to the oak doors. They were heavy, and the iron hinges were scaled with rust. And when she pressed both palms flat against the wood and pushed, nothing happened for a moment. And then something gave, not the hinges, but some internal resistance, some balance point that 50 years of closed stillness had established. And the doors swung inward with a sound that traveled from the bottom of the building to the top of the roofline before dispersing into the trees. It was not a creak. It was the sound a place makes when it opens after a very long time. And Nora stood in the doorway and let it finish before she went in. The interior was one room, 20 feet long, 15 wide, with a peaked ceiling that rose to the underside of the slate roof. 4 wooden pews on each side of a central aisle, simple and unpainted. The wood darkened to a deep walnut color by decades of contact with the air in the room. The floor was flagstone, the same variety of local stone as the walls, laid in irregular pieces with moss growing dense in the joints near the corners where the moisture came in. At the far end stood an altar, a rectangular block of stone 3 feet high, squared on 3 sides, and slightly rough on the top, as though it had been left one step short of finished intentionally. Above the altar on the wall, a wooden cross. Hand carved the small irregularities of the surface and the visible grain of the wood showing the evidence of a person rather than a process. Behind and below the cross, a small recessed niche in the wall, empty, the stone around its opening worn smooth in a way that suggested it had been touched many times. The stained glass window above the doors, blues and golds, and a deep red at the center, that she had seen from outside, filled the room with colored light that moved slowly across the floor as the clouds shifted, and the movement was unhurried and utterly without concern for her. And she stood in the aisle and watched it, and felt for the first time in 3 years that she had arrived somewhere. She walked to the altar. Her footsteps on the flagstone were the only sound. The pews creaked faintly as she passed them, not from contact, but from something in the floor, some settling in the stone that her weight redistributed. At the altar, she stopped and placed both hands flat on the cool surface. She stood that way for a while, palms down on the stone, not praying, because she did not have a framework for prayer, not performing anything, because there was no one to perform for, simply being still in the way that the building around her was still. It was when she ran her right hand along the edge of the altar that she felt it. A seam, a clean line where the top slab met the body of the block beneath it, separated by a gap barely wide enough to catch a thumbnail. She pressed down on the capstone and it did not flex. She pressed harder and it did not move. She took a satchel off her shoulder and set it on the nearest pew, and came back to the altar and put both hands on the slab and pushed sideways with her full weight behind it. The stone moved, a grinding sound that was very loud in the quiet room. A slow, resistant sliding, and the slab moved 6 inches before she stopped pushing. 6 inches was enough. The interior of the altar was hollow, a cavity 2 feet long and a foot deep carved into the stone body of the block. The inner surfaces rough-cut and darkened with age and moisture. On the floor of the cavity, resting on a small wooden platform that had been placed there to keep it elevated from the cold stone, was a box. Nora looked at the box for a moment without touching it. Then she reached in with both hands and lifted it out. It was wooden. The wood dark with age and sealed with something that had kept it from absorbing the moisture of the cavity completely. The corners were fitted with small brass plates tarnished to near black. A brass clasp on the front held a small padlock rusted in a way that suggested it had not been opened in decades. The box was heavier than its size suggested, and when she set it on the altar top and listened, she heard from somewhere inside it the faint sound of something shifting, something with density that moved fractionally when the box moved. She looked around the chapel. Late afternoon light through the stained glass, the empty pews, the hand-carved cross on the wall. On the wall beside the altar, hanging from a wrought iron hook, was an old fireplace poker. She took it down. She wedged the handle under the loop of the padlock and twisted. The rusted metal resisted for a moment, and then, on the second attempt, snapped. She opened the box. Inside, resting in dark velvet that had held its shape better than anything made of fabric had any right to after 50 years in a stone cavity, was a stack of envelopes. 17 of them, each sealed with red wax, each one addressed in the same careful copperplate hand in fountain pen ink that had faded from black to a dark brown to the next sole. And beneath the stack, separated slightly and sealed with black wax instead of red, one final envelope. The black seal caught the colored light differently than the others, heavier, more deliberate, like a door that was meant to stay closed until the right moment. Beneath all the envelopes, in a smaller compartment at the bottom of the box, was money. Paper currency bundled in 6 stacks bound with cotton string. The bills old and soft but intact. And beside the money, a small drawstring pouch of brown leather. The leather dry and stiff but uncracked, tied shut with a cord that had hardened to the consistency of wire. Nora untied the cord. She opened the pouch and looked inside. Gold coins, small and heavy, the size of large quarters, their surfaces warm-colored in the late light coming through the stained glass window. She tipped them into her palm and counted 34. The faces on them were Liberty heads, the kind that appeared in antique stores under glass American gold coins struck across 4 decades from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. The kind that the community members of an earlier era had kept tucked away rather than deposited in banks. They did not entirely trust. Held here in a leather pouch in a stone box, in a sealed altar in a forest in Herkimer County, contributed over decades by people who believed the place was worth preserving for whoever came after them. She put the coins back in the pouch and set it carefully in the box. She sat down on the nearest pew with the box beside her and the stack of envelopes in her hands. The black sealed envelope she set aside face down, separate from the others. She did not know why exactly, except that the weight of it felt different, and she understood without being told that different weight required different timing. The wax seal on the top red-sealed envelope was a simple impression of a cross. She broke it carefully, working her thumbnail under the edge without tearing the envelope. She unfolded the letter inside. April 1971. Addressed to the next soul. The handwriting was careful and unhurried, the writing of someone who had decided what they wanted to say before they began. She read it once through without stopping. The letter told her that the chapel had been built in 1923 by a man named Father Emil Dreher, a veteran from Vermont who had come back from the First World War, having witnessed too much death and having lost his faith in organized institutions, but not in the necessity of quiet. He had built the chapel alone, one stone at a time, over 4 years, using fieldstones collected from the creeks and hillsides around this clearing. He was not a priest in any official sense. He was simply a man who believed that places of quiet were as necessary as places of noise, and that the world needed more of them. A small community had formed around him in the 1920s and 30s, people who had lost something and needed somewhere to sit in silence without explaining themselves. They came and they sat, and Father Dreher did not ask them what they were doing. He understood that silence was the service. Father Dreher died in 1957. A few members continued visiting through the 1960s, maintaining the chapel on weekends. But as the years passed, the visits stopped. The letter was written by a woman named Clara Voss, who had been coming to the chapel since 1934, when her mother brought her here at age 12 after her younger brother drowned in the Mohawk River. She had come back year after year for 37 years to sit in the pews and feel his presence in the quiet. The community had maintained a small fund over the decades, donations, legacies from members who had passed. The gold coins had been contributed by members across several generations who believed the place worth endowing for whoever came next. Clara was writing in 1971, knowing she would be the last to come. She was leaving the box in the altar because she believed, as Father Dreher had believed, that the chapel would find its next caretaker. The letter ended, "Take what you need. Keep the chapel if you can. And if you cannot keep it, at least come here sometimes and sit in the quiet. The quiet is what matters. Everything else is just walls." Nora read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it back in the envelope and sat on the pew with her hands in her lap and the box beside her. The stained glass light moved slowly across the stone floor. She did not cry. Her eyes filled in the way that eyes fill when the body receives something it has not had in a long time. But the tears stayed there, present but not falling, which was the only way her body had ever known how to do this, to hold the feeling fully without letting it break open, to stay present in it, until it became something she could carry. Clara had written, "You found it because you needed to find it." She looked around the empty chapel, at the pews worn smooth by decades of people sitting, at the cross that someone had carved by hand, at the window that had held its colors through 50 years of no one looking at it, at the stone walls that had stood since 1923 and would stand if anyone cared for them for 100 years more. She understood, sitting on that pew in the diminishing afternoon light, that caring for things was its own kind of answer. Not a plan, not a career path, not a trajectory that Margaret Holloway would have recognized as progress, but an answer to a question she had been carrying without knowing the shape of it. The question of what she was for, the question of what it meant to be watchful rather than restless, present rather than ambitious. She closed the box. She sat in the chapel until the last of the colored light faded from the floor, and the room went to a uniform gray. Then she stood, lifted the box, settled it under her arm, and walked out through the heavy oak doors into the blue dusk of the clearing. The letter from Herkimer County arrived on a Thursday, 9 days after Nora had signed the purchase agreement and walked out of Ruth Calder's office. She was eating breakfast at the small table in her room at Helen Marsh's boarding house, a narrow Victorian on Prospect Street, 2 blocks from the Little Falls main drag, when Helen knocked and slid the envelope under the door with the wordless efficiency of a woman who had been running rooms for 30 years and understood that tenants valued their mornings. The envelope had the county seal in the upper left corner. Nora set down her coffee and opened it. The language was administrative and precise. It informed her that pursuant to Section 14.09 of the New York State Historic Preservation Act, and in accordance with the disclosure clause she had signed at the time of purchase, the county was formally requesting an inventory of any objects, documents, or materials of potential historic significance discovered on the property at Old Logging Road, parcel 2003-HK-114-E. It noted that under certain conditions, objects meeting the statutory definition of historic artifacts could be subject to state custody pending formal evaluation. It gave her 30 days to respond. Nora read the letter twice. She felt something settle in her chest that was not quite fear, but occupied the same neighborhood. A cold, alert stillness. The feeling of a situation that had more dimensions than it had appeared to have a moment ago. She had the box. The box contained $21,400 in bundled currency, 34 gold coins and 17 sealed envelopes plus the black sealed one. Under a reading of the statute she had just been handed, all of it was potentially subject to state review. She put the letter in her notebook. She finished her coffee. Then she went downstairs and asked Helen whether she knew any lawyers in town who did low-cost consultations. Helen Marsh was 71 and had the physical economy of a woman who had never wasted a movement in her life. She was drying dishes when Nora came into the kitchen, and she did not stop drying when she answered. She said that her son Daniel had a practice on Mohawk Street, 2 blocks east of the hardware store, and that he did not advertise reduced rates, but that he was a reasonable man and Nora should tell him she was staying at the house. She set a plate in the rack and picked up a mug. "He knows what things actually cost," she said, with the particular emphasis of a mother who has watched her son undercharge people for 20 years and has decided to be proud of it rather than frustrated. Daniel Marsh was 58 and had the careful eyes of a man who had spent 3 decades reading documents for the words they were trying not to say. His office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building that also housed an insurance agent and a tax preparer, and he came out himself to get her when she arrived without an appointment. He read the county letter without comment. Then he looked up at her over the top of his glasses. "What did you find?" She told him everything in the order it had happened. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet in the way that suggested he was sorting things rather than deciding them. Then he said, "I know that name, Clara Foss. She taught 3rd grade at this school from 1958 to 1983. She died in 1989. He paused. "She never talked about the chapel, not that I remember, but she was that kind of person. She held things carefully." He explained that the statute had been written primarily to address archaeological materials and had been imprecisely extended in the 1990s to cover materials found in historic structures. The critical question was whether the items in the box had been deliberately placed as a private bequest or had been abandoned in a way that left them without a legal owner. The 17 envelopes, all addressed to the next soul, all sealed, constituted evidence of intent as clear as he could imagine. Without a notary being present, he would write back to the division requesting an extension and prepare a response arguing that these materials constituted a private testamentary gift and that state jurisdiction did not apply. It was a defensible position. It might take 6 weeks to resolve. Nora asked about the money, whether she could use it while the question was open. Daniel said technically the funds were in legal limbo until the state declined jurisdiction, and that using them before that point was inadvisable. He said he did not think anyone was paying particularly close attention, given that the Division of Historic Preservation was a state agency with limited staff and a very large portfolio of neglected matters. But he would prefer she waited. She asked how much he charged. He looked at her for a moment with the careful eyes. Then he said he would handle the matter for $300 payable when it was resolved. He said his mother had called him before Nora arrived, which was not unusual. She had $204 left after 6 days at the boarding house. She thanked him and walked back through the September afternoon and worked out on the inside back cover of her notebook exactly how long her remaining money would last. At $85 a week, she had approximately 17 days. The state response would take 30 days minimum. She was short by 2 weeks and a margin. She went back downstairs. Helen was in the sitting room with a book. Nora stood in the doorway and said she had a proposition. She could help with the house cleaning, shopping, cooking, whatever Helen needed, in exchange for extending her stay through October at a reduced rate. She said she expected to have funds available by mid-October and would settle the balance then. Helen did not look up from her book immediately. When she did, her expression was neither warm nor cold, but considered. She said she was not in the habit of making arrangements like that because they tended to create ambiguity about expectations. And ambiguity in a household was the source of most friction. She said if Nora wanted to work for her stay, she would need to be specific about what she was agreeing to. They spent 15 minutes at the kitchen table going through it. Nora left with a list Monday and Thursday mornings, full clean of the common areas and 2 bathrooms. Grocery run every Tuesday. Dinner 3 nights a week, whatever she could cook from what was in the kitchen. In exchange, her room through October 15th at no charge. She could manage this. She could manage this and still walk to the chapel every day, which was what mattered. The days developed a structure. She was up before 7, had coffee in the kitchen, while Helen read the paper, cleaned or shopped on the scheduled days, and walked to the chapel on the others. The walk was 4 miles round trip from the house to the trailhead, plus the mile-long path through the forest each way. She carried her tools in her backpack, a stiff brush, a spray bottle of diluted white vinegar for the stone, a small pry bar she had found in the chapel itself, a notebook. On the days she was not cleaning or shopping, she spent 6 or 7 hours at the chapel. She began with an inventory, moving from corner to corner and writing down the condition of every surface she could reach. The slate roof needed attention at the ridge, but was fundamentally sound. The flagstone floor was solid throughout, the mortar between the stones crumbled in places but not gone. 2 of the 8 pews had cracked seatboards, the cracks running with the grain from the back edge toward the front. The kind of crack that comes from wood drying out over decades rather than from impact. She scrubbed the flagstone floor on her 3rd day on her hands and knees with a stiff brush and a bucket of water she had carried in from the creek at the edge of the property. The work took 4 hours and left her arms aching from the shoulder down. When she was done, the floor was a different surface, the stone itself unchanged, but the moss gone from all but the deepest joints near the corners, and the colors in the individual stones visible again, the warm tans and rusts, and the occasional dark blue-gray that appeared in the Adirondack fieldstone of that region. She sat on the floor when she finished and looked at it for a while in the colored light from the window, and the ache in her arms was not unpleasant. She cleaned the pews next 2 days of work using a soft cloth and a thin paste of beeswax she had made from a block purchased at the hardware store. The wood was white oak, she discovered when she looked up the grain pattern in a field guide from Helen's bookshelf, and it received wax the way very dry ground receives rain, drawing it in immediately visibly grateful. When the pews were done, they had a soft depth to them that had not been visible under the decades of accumulated grime, the grain coming forward like something waking up. The letter from the Division of Historic Preservation arrived 6 weeks after Daniel had submitted his response. He called Nora at Helen's house to tell her before the mail arrived. The state had reviewed the documentation and agreed that the materials found in the chapel constituted a private testamentary gift rather than an abandoned artifact deposit and was formally declining jurisdiction. The funds and all associated materials were hers. She thanked him and walked to his office before 5 and paid him $300 from the bundle currency, counting the bills at the kitchen table in the caretaker's shelter, where she had been staying for a week. She walked back to Helen's house in the October afternoon with the box under her arm and $300 less than she had started with, feeling lighter than she had felt since August. The money had been abstractly hers for 6 weeks. Now it was concretely hers, and the difference between those two states was not abstract at all. The roofer's name was Ed Kowalski, recommended by the hardware store owner as reliable and unusually honest about what a job would actually cost. Ed was 60 compact with the particular physical confidence of someone who had spent 40 years on rooftops and had never once doubted his relationship with gravity. He hiked the mile path to the chapel without complaint, spent 2 hours on the roof before he came down, and told Nora that the slates were in better condition than the condemnation report had suggested, probably because the surrounding trees had shielded the roof from the worst of the weather for decades. The ridge cap was the main problem. The original mortar had failed along a 12-foot section at the peak, leaving the interior exposed to water infiltration that had not yet caused visible damage, but would within 2 winters if left unaddressed. The flashing at the base of the chimney was gone entirely. He could do it in 3 days. He arrived on a Monday with his son and worked steadily through 3 days of overcast October weather that stayed dry as though the sky understood the situation and was being cooperative. On the second day, Ed called down from the ridge. "You want my honest opinion of this building?" Nora said yes. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. The stonework on these walls is better than anything put up in this county in the last 50 years. This roof will outlast both of us if you keep the drainage clear. He went back to motoring without waiting for a response, which was itself a kind of respect. She had found the caretaker's shelter on her second visit to the property, a small structure set back from the chapel in the trees to the northeast, barely visible until you were standing at its door. One room, the same fieldstone construction as the chapel, with a wood-burning stove in one corner and a writing table against the window, and a frame for a bed that had lost its roping but retained its posts. The floor was wide plank pine, several boards soft with rot near the door that she replaced herself, pulling the bad boards with the pry bar and cutting replacements from a pine plank she had carried in from the hardware store truck that met her at the trailhead. On the writing table, carved into the surface in careful block letters, were 4 words. "Silence is not emptiness." The carving was old, the wood around the letters darkened in a way that suggested decades. But the letters themselves were still sharp-edged, still legible in any light. The deliberate inscription of someone who had needed to put that sentence somewhere permanent. She ran her finger along the letters and understood without needing to verify that Father Dreher had carved them, that this was his desk and his certainty and his gift to whoever came after him. She moved her things from Helen's house on an early October morning, making 4 trips down the path with the backpack and 2 canvas tote bags. And Helen stood at the top of her porch steps and watched the last trip go with an expression that was not quite worried and not quite approving, but somewhere between the expression of a woman who has seen enough of life to know that the things someone needs and the things someone should probably do are not always the same, and who has also learned that distinguishing between them is not always her job. The stove worked. She discovered this the first evening in the shelter, when she lit it with newspaper and birch bark from a fallen tree at the edge of the clearing, and the flue drew clean, and the firebox held its heat, and within 40 minutes the single room was warm, in a way that a room with thick stone walls gets warm, which is total and pervasive. The heat in the walls as much as in the air. She made dinner on the 2-burner camp stove she had bought at the Army surplus store in Utica, and she ate at the writing table with the lantern burning and the stove ticking softly, and the forest outside completely dark and completely still. It was in those first evenings in the shelter that she read the remaining 16 red-sealed envelopes, one or two per evening, sitting at the writing table with the box open beside her. Each envelope was from a different person, different handwriting, different decade, different voice. The earliest were from the 1920s and 30s, written in a formal style that the century had since abandoned, full of careful subordinate clauses and the slightly stiff diction of people writing their most important thoughts. A man named Robert Aiken, who had come to the chapel after losing his wife in childbirth. A woman named Dorothea Fells, who had driven from Utica after her son did not come home from the Second World War and had come back every year for 19 years afterward. A retired school teacher named Samuel Pruitt, who wrote with the precision of a man accustomed to clarity, and who said, "Only I came here with everything broken. I left with everything still broken, but differently arranged." It took me 3 years to understand that differently arranged was enough. She set Samuel Pruitt's letter down and looked out the window at the dark trees for a long time. The later envelopes were less formal. A woman from the 1960s, who had clearly been coming to the chapel for years before she wrote a letter, and whose voice had the intimacy of someone writing to a friend they had not yet met. A man in 1968 who wrote 3 sentences. "I don't know what I believe. I know that this place doesn't require me to know. That's why I come." A teenager, judging by the handwriting undated, who had
It's
written a full
so
page in a
beautiful
rush of
out
feeling
here.
that
It
did not
is,
resolve
dear.
into
Let's
any
take a
particular
walk.
I'd
conclusion,
love that.
but was fully and unmistakably alive on the page, the way things written in the middle of the feeling always are. She understood when she finished the last of the red envelopes what the collection represented. Clara Voss had not written all 17 letters herself. She had gathered them, reaching out in the years before 1971 to the remaining members of the community, asking each of them to write something for the person who would come after. The box was not one person's bequest. It was the accumulated testimony of everyone who had understood what the chapel was for. She put the letters back in the box in order. She set the box on the shelf above the writing table, between a dictionary she had brought from Helen's house and the red hardcover notebook from her mother's last weeks. She looked at the 3 objects next to each other on the shelf for a moment. Then she picked up her current notebook and she began to write. Not the stories she had written as a teenager, which had been about invented people in invented places. This was something different. It began as an attempt to describe what she had found in the chapel. But as she wrote, it became an attempt to explain what she understood about the relationship between loss and quiet, between the need for witness and the inadequacy of language to provide it. It became an attempt to explain why a place could matter more than the people who had built it, why the walls outlasted the prayers, why the stone went on when the voices that had filled it were gone. She wrote for 2 hours that first night, and stopped, not because she was finished, but because the lantern was getting low and she had learned to conserve the oil. She closed the notebook and looked at what she had written, 23 pages in the small even hand she had inherited from her mother, and she thought, "This is what I was trying to do." She did not yet know what that meant in any practical sense. But she was certain in the way she was sometimes certain about things before she had the evidence that she was moving in the right direction. The first visitor appeared on a Tuesday in late October. She had told no one about the chapel being open. She had not posted anything, had not put up a sign at the trailhead. She had simply opened the doors each morning at 8 and left them open until dusk. She was on the stone bench beside the door sharpening a chisel when she heard footsteps on the path, a slow, deliberate sound, the footfall of someone picking their way carefully over the roots and fallen branches. The woman who came through the trees was perhaps 75, small-framed in a wool coat the color of dried leaves. She stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at the chapel with an expression Nora could not read from where she sat. Not surprise, not recognition. Something more complicated than either. Then she looked at Nora. "It's open," she said. Not a question. Nora said it was. The woman crossed the clearing slowly and paused at the door. "My grandmother used to talk about this place," she said. "She came here in the 30s, after she lost her brother." She paused. I always thought she was exaggerating how beautiful it was. She went inside. She was in there for 50 minutes. Nora stayed on the bench and did not go in. When the woman came out, she touched Nora's arm lightly with a hand that was thin and dry and very certain. "Thank you for keeping this," she said, her voice quiet and entirely without sentiment, the voice of someone stating a fact. Then she walked back across the clearing and into the trees and was gone. Nora sat on the bench for a long time after. She thought about the woman's grandmother who had come to this clearing in the 1930s carrying grief that would outlast her by 2 generations, and about the man who had built the chapel for exactly that purpose, and about all the people in the 16 envelopes. She thought about Samuel Pruitt's sentence, "Everything still broken but differently arranged." She picked up the chisel and went back to work. By the end of November, there had been 11 visitors. None of them had been directed here by anything Nora had done. They arrived the way the first woman had arrived, by memory, by rumor, by the specific gravity that some places exert on the people connected to their histories. A man in his 50s who had heard about the chapel from his father, who had heard about it from someone at the Utica Veterans Hall. 2 women in their 30s who had driven from Albany and found the trailhead after an hour of searching. A boy of maybe 12 alone who stood outside the chapel door for 10 minutes before going in and who left a folded piece of paper in the leather pouch Nora had hung near the entrance. She had put up the pouch on the second week, a small drawstring bag of brown leather hung from a hook beside the door on a piece of cord with a handwritten card below it that said simply, "Leave a name if you want." She had not specified whose name or for what purpose. She had not needed to. The pouch filled slowly with small folded pieces of paper, and every few days she would take them out and open them, and almost all of them contained the same thing, a name. Sometimes just a first name, sometimes a full name with dates, sometimes a name and a single word, father, daughter, brother, friend. She kept them in a small wooden box on the shelf in the shelter. The box accumulated weight the way that grief accumulates weight, steadily without announcement. One small addition at a time, until the sum of it was something you noticed when you lifted it. January in the Adirondack foothills is not a season so much as a condition. It settles over the land with a permanence that makes summer feel like a rumor. The snow that had arrived in December deepened through the first weeks of the new year, until the path from the trailhead to the chapel was a narrow channel between walls of white, the trees on either side loaded and silent, and the clearing so thoroughly covered that the stone bench had disappeared entirely. Nora had not had a visitor in 19 days. She understood this intellectually. The path was genuinely difficult in deep winter for anyone who did not know it well, and the people who came were not for the most part people in the habit of winter hiking. She had continued opening the doors each morning regardless. A place that was only available in good weather was not the same kind of place as one that was available in all weather. The difference mattered, though she could not have explained it precisely. It was the difference between a promise and a conditional offer. What she had not anticipated was what the silence of January would do to the inside of her own head. In the fall, when the visitors were coming, and the work of restoration had given each day its physical structure, she had moved through the hours with a sense of forward motion that did not require examination. But deep winter had removed most of that scaffolding. The chapel was in good repair. The shelter was warm and weathertight. The firewood was stacked against the north wall. There was nothing urgent to fix, and the days were short and gray, and the forest outside the window was a study in stillness that bordered in the long evenings on rebuke. She wrote every day, filling pages with the same small, precise script covering ground she had not covered before her father. The particular quality of mourning someone you barely knew, how an absence can be as specific as a presence if you pay enough attention. She wrote about her mother with a directness she had not been capable of in the months immediately after Delia died. Distance had given her access to it, not distance exactly, but the clarity that came from having arrived somewhere so far from everything familiar that the familiar could finally be seen whole. But the writing which had been sustaining through the fall was beginning to feel insufficient in a way she could not yet characterize. She was filling the pages. The pages were full of true things. And still in the long January evenings with the stove ticking and the lantern burning down, something in her was asking a question she could not locate clearly enough to answer. She was 20 years old, living alone in a stone shelter in the woods in the middle of a New York winter. And the question of whether this was courage or avoidance had begun to press against her with a persistence she could not write her way past. She opened the black wax envelope on a Wednesday. She had known it was there since October had set it aside face down in the box and not touched it in 3 months. She had told herself this was because she was not yet in the condition the envelope was written for. She had believed this until she stopped believing it, which happened gradually. And then suddenly, the way most true things arrive. She was not in crisis, but she had come to understand that need was not always loud. Sometimes it was precisely this, a quiet erosion of certainty, a slow withdrawal of confidence that the right choice had been made. She took the envelope from the box. The black wax seal bore the same cross impression as the red ones. She broke it carefully and unfolded the letter inside. It was not from Clara. The handwriting was different, older, more formal. The ink faded further toward a pale sepia. The signature at the bottom read, Dorothea Fells, the woman who had driven from Utica after her son did not come home from the war, who had come back every year for 19 years. The letter was short. It said that she was writing at the request of Father Dreher, who had asked her before his death in 1957 to prepare something for a specific kind of visitor. Not the visitor who came with grief and found comfort, but the visitor who came to stay, who took on the work of the place, who might find themselves in the long middle of that work, wondering if it was enough, wondering if they had chosen correctly. Dorothea Fells wrote, Father Dreher used to say that doubt was not the opposite of faith. He said, doubt was faith's companion, the thing that walks beside it to keep it honest. He said anyone who arrived at certainty too quickly was not paying attention. He said the chapel was built for people who were still in the middle of not knowing, and that included the person who kept it. She wrote, if you are reading this, you are in the middle. You are not at the beginning where everything is clear because it is new, and you are not at the end where things become clear again because they are finished. The middle is the hardest place to inhabit. It asks you to continue without the reward of resolution. Father Dreher did this for 34 years. He was never certain. He was only willing. And then at the bottom of the page, a list. 23 names in 2 columns written in Dorothea's careful hand. No dates, no explanations. Just names, full names first and last, the names of people who had come to stay, or come and kept coming, or contributed to the life of the place over the decades in some way that warranted being recorded. At the bottom of the list, added in different ink. Clara Voss's ink, the darker brown. Nora recognized from the first letter. A note in Clara's handwriting. They all doubted. They all stayed. Nora sat at the writing table for a long time with the letter open in front of her. The stove had burned down to coals and the room had cooled without her noticing. She got up and put 2 pieces of wood in the stove and waited until they caught before she went back to the table. The list of 23 names looked back at her from the page. 23 people across however many decades who had arrived at the same question she was currently sitting inside and had not resolved it so much as decided to keep going anyway. The distinction between resolving a question and deciding to continue despite it was not a subtle one. It was the entire weight of what Dorothea and Clara and Father Dreher himself had been trying to leave behind for whoever came next. Something in her chest, something that had been tightening imperceptibly for weeks, released with a physical sensation as clear as a muscle unknotting. She sat with that release and breathed, and looked at the snow falling past the window, in the dark falling the way snow falls, when there is no wind straight down, and unhurried, each flake taking its time. She refolded the letter and put it back in the envelope, and she put the envelope in the wooden box with the folded papers from the visitor's pouch. Not with the original 17 in the lacquered box, but in this smaller box, the one she had started herself. because it belonged with the continuing record rather than the founding one. Then she picked up her notebook and she wrote for 3 hours without stopping. And what she wrote was about her mother. It was the thing she had been circling for months and had not yet entered directly the account of the 6 months of illness, and the last weeks, and the red notebook, and the hand she had held on a Tuesday in April. She wrote it open the way Dorothea Fels had written open, without protecting herself from the things she was saying. When she finished, she closed the notebook and sat for a moment in the cool room and understood with a clarity she had not felt since the afternoon she first pushed open the chapel doors, that this was what she was for. Not the chapel specifically. The chapel was the place that had made the condition available to her. What she was for was the practice the condition made possible. Spring arrived in stages. First, the light, which changed before the temperature, did lengthening at both ends of the day and shifting from the flat white of winter to something with more angles in it. Then the creek at the property's boundary locked under ice, since December began to speak again in early March. Then the smell of the soil returning through the snow as the ground began to thaw, the deep earth smell of that north-facing clearing that she had first noticed on the walk in the previous September, and that she now understood as one of the signatures of the place. The visitors returned with the spring, more of them than the fall arriving with greater frequency, as though word had continued its slow lateral spread through the networks of people who knew people who had come here or whose grandmothers had come here. She was seeing 3 or 4 people a week by April, occasionally more on weekends. They arrived as they always had, alone mostly, or in twos without announcement. Hiking the path with the particular focus of people who have decided to make a difficult approach to something they are not entirely sure they will find. She had made one change to the entrance arrangement. Beside the leather pouch for names, she had hung a second smaller pouch with a card inside it that said, "If you would like to write something, there is paper and a pen inside." People used it. Not everyone, not even most people, but some of them took the paper and the pencil inside and left both in the pouch when they came out. And when she retrieved them in the evenings and unfolded them, she found the same range she had found in the original 17 letters. The formal and the rushed, the articulate and the wordless, the name and a sentence, the paragraph and the silence that came after it. She added these to the wooden box. She was building an archive without having planned to build one, which was the only way archives get built, by someone paying attention long enough that the accumulation achieves a significance the individual items did not announce. In the second week of December, a man she had not seen before appeared in the clearing, late 20s, in a heavy canvas work jacket and boots that were more practical than most people wore for this trail. He crossed the clearing and stopped at the door and looked at Nora, who was at the bench with a notebook. "Someone told me about this place," he said, the way people say things they have been rehearsing. "At the VA in Utica." He paused. I don't know what I believe about any of this." Nora looked at him steadily. "You don't have to believe anything," she said. "You just have to sit." He stayed for an hour and a half longer than any previous visitor except the first woman. When he left, he put something in the leather pouch. Not a folded paper, but a small photograph. A young man in military uniform standing in front of a truck somewhere that was not New York. Nora found it that evening. She put it with the papers in the wooden box and did not look at it again that night. She wrote about it instead. Not about him specifically, but about what it meant to offer a place to people who had no language for what they needed, and why the absence of language was not a failure, but a threshold, and why crossing it required somewhere to be that asked nothing from you except your presence. Daniel Marsh came to the chapel on a Saturday in late April, the first time he had visited in person. He arrived at mid-morning and stood in the clearing and looked at the building with the expression of a man who has heard about something for years and is now comparing the description to the reality. He went inside, and was in there for 30 minutes, which was longer than she expected from a man whose professional relationship to this property had been transactional. When he came out, he sat on the bench beside her and did not speak for a moment. And she let him have the silence because she had learned through months of watching people come out of the chapel that the silence immediately after was often the most important part. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out an envelope. A regular white envelope with her name on the front, in handwriting she did not recognize. He said that a retired school teacher from Utica had come into his office 2 weeks ago. She had brought a printed document, a piece of writing several pages that had been posted somewhere online, a community forum, or a local history board by someone who had visited the chapel and had later found Nora's writing in the visitor's pouch and had typed it up and shared it with attribution. Daniel had read the first paragraph of the printout before the school teacher took it back and sealed it in the envelope. She said, and here he paused in the way he paused when choosing words with precision, that it was the best thing she had read in 20 years, and she taught 7th grade English for 31 of them, and she wanted the person who wrote it to know that. He set the envelope on the bench between them. She also included the contact information for a small press in Albany, literary nonfiction. They got hold of it somehow. Nora looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she picked it up and turned it over in her hands without opening it. The envelope had weight not from the paper inside, but from what it represented, which was the first confirmation from outside her own conviction that the writing she had been doing in the shelter by lantern light was something more than private. It was the first evidence that the practice she had arrived at through the particular sequence of losses and choices and accidents that had brought her to this clearing was communicable, that it could travel, that it could mean something to people who had not been here. After Daniel left, she went inside the chapel and sat in the third pew on the right side. She held the unopened envelope in her hands. The stained glass window above the door was filling the room with the warm mobile light of spring, the colors shifting faster than they did in winter, as the new leaf trees outside moved in the light wind, the blue and gold and deep red making slow patterns on the stone floor that were never the same twice. She thought about the letter she had written about her mother. She thought about Samuel Pruitt's differently arranged. She thought about Father Dreher building the chapel alone, one stone at a time, over 4 years, not for any congregation, but for the idea of gathering for the people who would come after, whoever they turned out to be carrying whatever they turned out to be carrying. She thought about Delia, who had kept a notebook in her purse for years, writing down the things her daughter said. Delia had understood something that Nora was only now catching up to, that paying attention to something was a form of devotion, and that devotion did not require a subject that was sacred by any formal definition. It only required that the attention be genuine, sustained, and offered without expectation of return. Nora opened the envelope. Inside was a folded printout of several pages, and behind it a smaller card with the name and address of Meridian Books in Albany. 4 lines of contact information handwritten below a printed logo. She set the card on the pew beside her and unfolded the printout. Her own handwriting looked different, typed, more formal. The sentences more exposed without the intimacy of the physical script. She read the piece as though someone else had written it, which was the only useful way to read your own work from outside, with the willingness to be surprised. She was surprised, not by the sentences themselves which she remembered writing, but by what they added up to, by the argument the accumulation made without her having consciously constructed an argument. The piece was about the chapel, but it was also about the quality of presence that loss strips you down to, the way grief removes your tolerance for the superficial, the way a person who has been broken open and stayed open becomes capable of receiving things that a defended person cannot. It was about sitting in old stone rooms and being witnessed by the weight of other people's silences. It was about her mother and Father Dreher and Clara Voss and all the people who had come here across a century, carrying the unresolvable. It was good. She knew it was good the way you know a thing when the knowing has no anxiety in it. Not the nervous claim of someone who hopes they are right, but the steady recognition of someone who has developed over years of reading and writing and paying attention, the ability to tell the difference. She sat with this knowledge for a moment, and then she looked at the card from Meridian Books. She understood that the card represented a door, and that the question of whether to open it was not as simple as the question of whether she wanted to. She understood the risk that addressing an audience might alter the practice that had produced the writing in the first place, that the desire to communicate and the desire to be seen were not the same desire, and that the second one, if you let it in without examining it, would eventually colonize the first. She picked up the card. She turned it over. On the back, in the same handwriting as the contact information, the retired school teacher had added a line. Silence is not emptiness. I found that in your writing, and I've been thinking about it ever since. Nora looked at the line. She recognized it as something she had written in the early winter, in one of the nights when the writing had come hard and then suddenly easy. She had written it without knowing what it would mean to anyone else, without knowing it would mean anything beyond the page. She put the card in her notebook. She put the printout in the notebook behind it. She closed the notebook and held it in her lap for a moment, sitting in the pew in the chapel in the spring afternoon, with the wood thrushes calling from the birch grove and the light moving across the floor in colors that Father Dreher had chosen in 1923 and that had been holding here ever since patient as everything else in this building. She stayed in the chapel through the afternoon. She did not write. She sat and listened to the creek and the birds and the occasional sound of wind crossing the top of the clearing. And she watched the light move across the floor in its slow choreography of color. And she let the day be what it was, which was ordinary and extraordinary at once, the way all days were in this place once you learned to stop demanding they be one or the other. At dusk, she closed the chapel doors. She walked the few steps from the chapel entrance to the door of the shelter, a distance she had covered thousands of times now, without counting. She lit the lantern. She put water on the camp stove for tea. She sat at the writing table where Father Dreher had once sat at the desk, where someone had carved 4 words into the wood because they needed to put that sentence somewhere permanent. And she opened the notebook to a new page. Outside, the clearing was going to dark in the way spring clearings go to dark slowly, the sky holding its color long after the trees had lost theirs, the last light gathering in the open space above the grass, and lingering there as though reluctant to give the day over to whatever came next. The chapel was a dark shape in the dimming light, its stone walls the color of the earth around it, its cross at the peak still leaning fractionally to the left, the way it had been leaning when she arrived and would be leaning for years to come. She wrote the date at the top of the page. Then she wrote a single line, not as a title and not as a caption, but as the first sentence of something she did not yet know the shape of. The sentence said, "There are places that exist not to be visited, but to be tended. And the tending is itself the point, and if you are lucky and paying attention, the tending tends you back." She looked at the sentence for a moment, then she kept writing. Below the writing table in the wooden box on the lower shelf between the dictionary and the red hardcover notebook, the folded papers from the visitor's pouch accumulated their quiet weight. The names of the dead, the sentences that did not resolve, the one photograph of a young man in uniform, standing in front of a truck somewhere that was not here. Above the table in the lacquered box with the brass corners, the 17 letters lay in their order. The red wax seals mostly intact, the black one open now and placed back in its envelope alongside Dorothea Feld's list of 23 names. 2 collections, one fixed in the past, one continuing into the future, and the person at the table, the living bridge between them. The current point of contact between what the chapel had held and what it was still accumulating night by night, visitor by visitor, name by folded name. The tea water boiled. She made the tea and came back to the table and picked up her pen. The lantern burned steady. The stove held its warmth. The chapel stood outside in the dark the way it had always stood in all its decades of seasons, in all its years of being found and refound by the people who needed to find it. not advertising itself, not diminishing itself, simply present in the woods of Herkimer County, New York, holding the specific silence that was its only offering and its most necessary one. It was enough. It had always been enough. Everything else was just walls.